This week we talk about who's going to Glastonbury, who did go to the National Prayer Breakfast and what was said, and of course the two big votes in Parliament last week. And they were conscience votes, and we have a forthright disagreement about whether conscience or free votes are a good idea. Join us on Cross Section. Hello and welcome to Cross Section. This week we'll be discussing again the week's news, Glastonbury, whether anybody's going along to that, the two big votes in Westminster last week. We'll be talking about welfare reform, and in the middle of all that we'll have a bit of a debate about whether conscience votes are a good idea. Danny, Alicia, lovely to have you with us.
Good morning.
Lovely to have you. Yeah, you're the more the guest, but
I'm
yeah.
the visitor. Yeah, it's fair. But we're all in the studio together, which is nice. So if you're watching on YouTube, you've already worked that out. If you're listening, Danny's here with his cup matching his shirt.
Yeah, I've gone for the floral colour scheme today.
I actually have a cup of coffee, but it's been banned from the table by Alicia.
Yeah, your pink mug didn't match the colour scheme.
It's harsh. It's harsh. So at 8 o'clock this morning, Glastonbury opened. We're recording on Thursday. I don't know what date.
It's Wednesday.
No, we're not.
It's Wednesday.
Yeah.
Recording on Wednesday. That's very exciting. Right, we're recording on a Wednesday morning, and Glastonbury opened this morning at 8 a.m.
It did.
Are you going?
No, I'm not. But the BBC are running a live feed of people arriving, which is just ridiculous. Like this, about people being saying this is the most exciting traffic jam I've ever been in.
Everything's
It's just
nice.
bizarre.
Kneecap are going to Glastonbury?
Yeah, they are. And politicians have spoken outright against them performing. I think what's going to be interesting is whether BBC, they always show performances, whether you're on the main stage or the fringe stage, and there's real pressure on the BBC whether they will show Kneecap's performance.
But they don't show all performances, so it's quite easy for them not to show it. I'd have thought it's a conscious decision for them to broadcast Kneecap if they do. Which would be very controversial.
That would be surprising if they did, but then the BBC always surprise. England won the cricket, Danny.
Ah, that was a great match.
At Headingley, that's their favourite ground.
Yeah, and I think the surprising thing was that it just felt like they were going to do it. It was a big task and they did it, but the England team are up for it.
We're not yet going to talk about the Lions, but when they start winning, we will. That's all I'm going to say about that. Anybody invited to the Jeff Bezos wedding?
I didn't know he was having one.
No, but you would be most likely to be invited out of the three of us, I feel.
That's my
Peter.
secret revelation. I actually have a ticket, but I'm not going to say anything. So Venice don't seem to want to have him. Do you know what the average cost of a UK wedding is?
Isn't it 35?
Well, less than, according to what I looked at.
Yeah.
25.
20 something, yeah.
Okay.
25. So Bezos' wedding is probably in line, similar as in proportionate to the average salary of the UK. It's probably a year's salary for him. It's probably less than. I mean, I'm not saying it's a good idea, but I'm just saying.
What's the cost of his wedding?
I don't know.
A lot.
A lot. Yeah, it's going to be big. So the story that caught my eye this week is supermarket sales are down 0.5%. And do you know why? You do, because I told you before we hit the record button. So Kantar, who do that piece of research, think that it's to do with Ozempic and the jabs, the skinny jabs. So some investors are withdrawing from like big drinks companies and sugary food firms because there are 1.5 million prescriptions for these drugs now in the UK. 4% of households are on them, and they think this is affecting supermarket sales.
Wow. Are they even regulated?
What, the drugs?
Yeah.
The drugs are.
If they're being prescribed, they have to be.
But I do think this is a big story in the 5 to 10 year horizon. It's going to come back to bite us big style.
What's your concern?
Suppresses appetite, doesn't change fundamental habits underneath, so you constantly have to be on it. So it's essentially you've created not quite an addiction, but a cycle, dependency. And their side effects are being talked about. There are some positive around heart rates and different things that seem to be being talked about, but fundamentally it doesn't reorientate your behavior except by controlling it using the drug. And you can eat. The quality of food seems to be largely irrelevant. Now, this suggests that sales of fattier foods are down, but as I understand it with these drugs, you can eat anything. You just don't have the same desire for it. But using a drug to suppress desire does not reorientate your own desires. So you don't control them properly. You don't learn to control them as a human being. That's problematic. And you don't eat healthier food.
But
and you create dependency.
Doesn't your body need less food? So if you get into a cycle of eating less, your body needs less food.
You desire less food. Do you need it? I mean, I think this is the unproven bit, but I also think it's going to become the biggest drug thing in the world, and I suspect it'll become a scandal of a sort.
Is this an alternative to stomach stapling. That's the other cosmetic.
Well,
people
it's an
use it
alternative
for.
to actually just controlling your appetite and eating well.
I
That's
agree
what
with
I mean
that.
to say, bluntly.
Fair enough.
But we'll see. I mean, that's a big, but I'm just that the headline story this week was the supermarket sales are down, and they're actually genuinely saying that is an impact on the reason, because 4% of households. So I think that's intriguing. What about the Middle East? What are we going to say about that? Actually, before we go there, I did like Martine Cruxall, I think it is, the BBC presenter, a story around, and the auto cue was telling her to say pregnant people, and she couldn't do it, and she just said woman.
Well, she said pregnant
rolled
people
her
and then
eyes.
immediately corrected herself that she wanted to say pregnant women.
Because it turns out there aren't pregnant people, they're always women. So it's a kind of rollback for reality. I was impressed. Okay, Middle East, Trump.
Well, we're recording on Wednesday morning.
Do you two even know what day it is?
We're recording on a day in the week.
I was just putting my caveat in that we're recording quite early this week. So saying anything could be
Trump has
well out
brokered
of
a
date.
ceasefire.
Well, yeah, but I'm saying that by Friday and the weekend when people are listening to this, that might not have changed again.
Yes.
So yes, things do look like things are holding. The intervention in Iran's very limited response seems to have then led to a ceasefire.
It's a very weird world in which Iran basically ring them up and say, we're going to do this to this base, get everything ready. And America get everything out of the base, knock out all the missiles coming in. And that allows Iran to say they did something, but America to say it was rubbish.
Yeah, one of the things I've read is that actually Iran's internal, the risks of protests internally are now quite high because the leadership are seen as weak. They've invested so much money in the nuclear program, which may well have just been blown up. Their response has been weak.
Or not, according to US
Well, that's
analysis.
the thing. No one actually knows what they've achieved or not achieved. But actually, the stability and security of the regime may well come under increased pressure.
And a reminder, if you didn't listen to last week's episode, what should you listen to, Alicia?
Absolutely should listen to David Yagnazar's input on the church in Iran and how they're responding. Great episode, encouragement. In fact, they have a prayer meeting tomorrow. So if you're signed up to their mailing, you can learn more about the response on the ground. So definitely an episode to tune into.
You probably, by the time you listen to this, will know it was yesterday. So anyway, that's Anne. Lastly on the week's news roundup, where were we all for breakfast yesterday?
London.
Anywhere specific in London?
Yeah, we were at the National Parliamentary Prayer Breakfast.
Takeaways, comments? Tell people what it was first, for those who don't know.
I mean, it's the first one since the general election. They press pause in the lead up, naturally, because it's time consuming and there's an election being called. So new parliamentary intake, an opportunity to gather church leaders, civic leaders, Christian organisations together with MPs to come and pray and hear the gospel being shared. And yesterday, well attended by the Christian community, I would say. It had 170 parliamentarians. I think it was 140 MPs. Disappointingly, there wasn't as strong a presence of cabinet ministers I had hoped for. Prime Minister being one, and several others leaving.
No Prime Minister, one cabinet minister.
Yes.
Well, there might have been others. There was definitely one cabinet minister.
West Streeting, we saw.
West Streeting was there.
I think it's worth saying. Like, I think if you're a Labour supporter and listener, like, reach out and ask where were the front bench. That is a surprising. This is one of the biggest events for engagement with the faith community and the Christian community explicitly.
So the formal host was Rachel Maskell, a Labour MP.
Yeah, but at the cabinet level, it was surprising. Who was there? Takeaways for you, Danny?
Well, I got to have
a bag of goodies. No,
I got to have a good chat with my local MP, which is a good opportunity. I hadn't met him; he was only elected in the last July. So that was a good chat. It was a good opportunity, and to talk to him about some of the local churches in our area. And that's one of the things we really want to encourage church leaders and MPs to build that relationship. And this was a great chance for MPs to meet local church leaders.
And so going forward for people, just so they know, this is the sort of thing you can reach out to your local MP and then engage. You have to look up on the National Prayer Breakfast website, but you can find out a little bit more on Christians in Parliament, information about it. And basically, as a church leader, you can invite your MP and go and be with them.
Like it sold out this year, but basically the main way that you're able to get a ticket if you want to come is if you're a church leader and you can get your MP to say they're coming, you can come along and join them, have breakfast. And it's just a great opportunity.
It's in the Westminster Hall.
It's in Westminster Hall, which is the oldest part of the UK Parliament.
There are angels carved into the rafters.
Indeed.
There is scripture written into the text of the floor.
Well, the floor in Central Lobby, a few rooms over.
Don't ruin my poetic articulation of what was happening
Accuracy is
there.
important for this podcast.
Accuracy is important. So the speaker was there of both the Lords and the Commons hosting, as you've said. So probably, I don't know, 500 plus thousand people?
600 or 700.
700. In the room, the Gettys were doing the worship, and then John Lennox was the speaker.
Yeah, John Lennox was really good. It was really helpful, just making the really strong articulation of the importance of faith in public life, that it is irrational, in fact, to try and exclude it. That to try and exclude it is privileging other views, that trying to exclude it isn't helpful, and that so much of our system, our structure, our cultural worldview is built on Christian values, and that we should recognize that, but also recognize the need for that input in our public life today.
Yeah, he definitely did a strong case for Christianity in the public square. And actually, you have to listen back, but I think I'm pretty confident he made a dig at secularist thought within policymaking, which I was like, great, because those who were in the room, particularly MPs that I know who are not believers, it's kind of a challenge to them to think you do come with a worldview, and sometimes more often than not, you think yours is supreme, and it stifles real engagement and debate from religious, but in particular Christian thinkers and organizations engaged in public policy. So yeah, he did a great job. But as I was slightly disappointed that the cabinet wasn't there.
But everybody has a worldview. Number one, so everybody's bringing faith to the conversation, as he said, and then the Christian faith explicitly brings human rights, the equality, the dignity conversation, and so much of the UK legislation in Parliament is based on that. The one thing I didn't know was that ministers are called ministers for that very reason. Senior politicians are called ministers because of some of the religious nature of serving the people. So that was a little takeaway. I would have liked him to expressly tie that to the 2 votes last week. He had a subtle move, I think, towards it, but I think he had the opportunity.
He referenced some of the kind of criticism of religious language in the debate, that people were being asked to keep religious beliefs out of it, and he was criticizing that, but he didn't really go further than that in his comments.
I just think there was a moment for that kind of essentially the call to repentance for what we did as a nation, and if you in a sense, the prayer breakfast is one place you can do that, and should. He did an excellent job and presented the gospel really clearly. So I just think there was a moment where you could have pushed that little bit further into that, but then that's maybe my provocative nature. We had the 2 difficult votes. We've already spoken a little bit about the abortion one last week, obviously, because it happened before we recorded. An interesting little piece from Julia Lopez, a Conservative MP, I believe, writing in Spectator magazine. Basically, where were the C of E, she expressly said, and other Christian leaders on the abortion vote, absent the playing field? Fair? And if so, why were they?
I mean, it's absolutely fair. I think the point that she's making specifically to the Church of England is that on other political and divisive and policy issues, the Church of England, the bishops have always been, either in the Lords or in their kind of press releases, very forthright and critical of government policy, be that immigration, be that poverty, be that debt, be that disability. So why, in the case of the unborn, which is actually should be strong territory in terms of theologically sanctity of life for the Church and the Church of England, in particular within Parliament, why was there a dearth?
Well,
and that's a question that I'm still asking.
The Church of England's response was weak.
Week's generous.
I was moderating my
it was absent essentially.
And afterwards they did respond, and they said the vote was worrying. Was about as strong as their response got. So I think it's very fair to criticise the Church of England for how they engaged with this. I think if you dig a bit deeper, you would realise that they struggle to engage because actually within the Church of England there is a diversity of opinions around this. We would say that it should be an area where the Church of England should lead and should speak out publicly, and I think they should. But actually, are they able to represent their church when there's actually a diversity of views around this? Maybe they feel that they're not able to.
And to be fair, retrospectively, grassroots campaign got a couple hundred ministers and 13 bishops, I think, to comment on it. But it did feel like after the fact. And then we moved from the abortion to the assisted suicide vote on Friday, and obviously people aware of the result and something we were deeply engaged in. Well, maybe start with Zoe Franklin on Premier, so a Lib Dem MP, saying, as a Christian, she voted for the legislation.
Well, there have always been Christians that have made an argument in favour of assisted suicide. Archbishop George Carey, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, is one very notable figure who does that. I disagree. I think their framing and their rationale for it is wrong. But people do take that view. So Zoe Franklin is entitled to view. It was a free vote in Parliament. I think we're going to get into some of that in a bit. And I think it's good that she is able to make her case and explain why she voted that way. And I think it's actually quite healthy to see a diversity of views. I would have liked more people to have voted against the bill. But I think for people to feel able to articulate why they vote a certain way is a good part of our system.
I mean, yes, it's good that she's expressed an opinion and a point of view. I think where I'm still bruised by last week's vote, both Christian and otherwise, the language of dignity and the language of compassion had been the forefront of the narrative of why this should go through. And I think for her, as writing in Premier as a Christian MP and saying, because of my Christian faith, and using language, words that God would not tolerate the suffering that we see at the end of life. And so it would therefore be compassionate to enable a piece of legislation that enables someone to choose to end their life through assisted suicide. I think as Christians, we can critique the use of that, not just language, but just that theology, that scriptural representation in the public square, that is a basis. She can have an opinion, but I think that is the wrong approach, particularly when you've got other groups, Christian and otherwise, from disability group and others, saying it's not compassionate when we ourselves don't really have choice, both in our healthcare currently and in end-of-life care. And so whereas the church speaking up on the issues of compassion and justice in a very difficult and strenuous point of time for people and families. And so I think I was a little bit annoyed that she leant strongly into what was Miss Kem Leadbeater's kind of arc about this is about compassion, this is about autonomy, and this is about choice. And all three of those phrasings was in her article in Premier that I was slightly disappointed by.
I think my support isn't for her position.
Oh yeah, of course.
My support is for her freedom of speech.
Yes.
To make the case. If I reflect on the vote and on the debate, quite a number of MPs changed their position. The vote did narrow, but there needed to be at least another 12 MPs to have changed their votes for it to have stopped. I think a lot of MPs who did think about it did recognise some of the challenges. I think where I would share Alicia's concern is what I heard repeatedly from MPs who were in favour of it or voting in favour of it was quite a simplistic repetition of the key lines given by Kim Leadbeater and other proponents of it, rather than actually engaging with people's concerns and criticisms of the actual bill that was there.
Okay.
People seem to be voting in favour of the intent and the purpose of it, rather than voting for the actual bill and the actual provisions that was on the paper that they were there to decide about. And I think that was where I was getting frustrated, was that people weren't grappling with the real criticisms. They were trying to stay at a theoretical level and say, yeah, we support assisted suicide. Well, okay, well, maybe you do, but actually what you're being asked to vote on is this piece of legislation and what this piece of legislation does. And people weren't grappling enough with that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you both. I think the dignity language is really problematic. You're pulling, again, this is where John Lennox is right, you're pulling from a Christian framework. This is what Tom Holland, Habermas and others teach us, kind of, that it comes from a Christian framework to get that. And then you subvert it, in my view. And the compassion has to mean, it does mean to suffer with. The whole heart of the Bible is the suffering with. Jesus comes and suffers on our behalf. He goes through that suffering. So the idea that you then that there's a Christian argument say, well, we can just sidestep that we take control. We put ourselves in the driving seat and decide when to end our lives. I just think it's anathema actually to Christianity to such a degree. So I do think there's deep problems with that. Again, space to make that case. But I think in our culture at large, that language is being co-opted. And this is one of the big challenges we have at this moment. Language is being subverted all the time, the ambiguity of meaning coming in, and it makes actually conversation, relationship really hard. Because every time you're having to redefine words and say, you mean this, Pat, but that's not a correct understanding, or you're reinterpreting a word, and it loses meaning. And then if we can't converse with one another, I mean, we know this from the Tower of Babel and all the way through the story, language is absolutely critical to our ability to engage. God spoke things into being. Language is incredibly important on this. So what, just for clarity, we've obviously had the vote. We understand the outcome in terms of that stage. There's a little bit of debate about what is going to happen in the Lords, because essentially this is a very important vote. That is the end in the Commons of round one, or a round. It goes to the Lords. There is limited opportunity for it to be overturned, but it is possible.
Well, yeah, there is plenty of opportunity.
Okay,
There's been a bit of misinformation. Lord Faulkner, who is a key supporter, has definitely been guilty of some misinformation about suggesting that it's not proper for the Lords to reject legislation. He has voted against legislation multiple times. The Lords can reject legislation. They have rejected private members' bills that have been passed by the House of Commons in the past. So,
for clarity, because the convention, the Salisbury Convention, relates to government.
It relates to government. It relates to government business that was voted on in their manifesto. So it's very narrow. It's not just government business. It's government business that is enacting their manifesto that they were voted in on. So the House of Lords are entirely free to vote it down. At some point, it has had its first reading, which is entirely notional, symbolic. There will be a second reading, probably in the first weeks of July, probably before the summer break, but it might not be.
They're saying September.
Yeah. And then the Lords will consider it in committee, and then there'll be a comparable report stage and third reading. If they make amendments to it, those then go back to the Commons and they bounce back and forward. The two key factors here is how long is this session going to last for? Classically, a parliamentary session is a year, but often the first session or after a general election is longer. This session started last July. People initially thought, it'll run till October or November. Now all the chat is it's going to run through till next spring. If it runs through to next spring, there is loads of time.
Because it must complete its passage in the session, just for clarity.
Whereas if it's October, November, it gets very tight. So I think that is a key factor. I think the second key factor is how much time the House of Lords decides to take in committee on this. The House of Lords is not bound by programme motions and restrictions in the same way the Commons are. There could be a lot of debate and discussion. They could debate and vote on every single amendment. There could be hundreds of amendments. It could literally clog up the House of Lords for days and days and days. There was also not the same precedence of government business over private members' business in the House of Lords. But at the same time, I think members of the House of Lords will be aware that the House of Commons have voted for this, and they will see their role primarily as scrutinising and improving it. So I think they could overturn it. I think they will give it detailed scrutiny. I think they probably will pass amendments that improves it. I think it'll be interesting to see what the level of support and opposition for this is when it comes to the first vote, whether that's in a few weeks or in September.
Okay, so in short, they're most likely to, what they would say, fix it. It's not the language I particularly like, but improve it.
I still think there is a role in the space for the House of Lords to reject it.
Yes, that's a possibility, but probably practically unlikely. But that's a possibility, and some will probably try and push for that.
Yes.
Some have been clear they don't like the bill at all. There's also a significant, reasonably high chance that they will then try and put a lot of amendments into it, because it is a bad. I mean, pretty much everybody acknowledges it's a bad bill. I mean, it's got deep flaws.
It's if you're a supporter of it, it's a bad bill.
So, and they will then try and they're already, we've talked to people in the Lords, there's cross-party support to start to try and move to at least do something around it. Okay, so we'll keep people updated as that keeps moving. As you've said, there's some technical stuff around how long it can go. It goes back down to the other house, ultimately to be voted through. There's timelines, there's various things. We've taken that probably as far as we can for now. We remain fundamentally opposed to it, and we will continue to campaign for that in the House of Lords. But this was a conscience vote.
Was it?
Whoa, and the hand is tipped already. Conscience votes, are they a good idea? Should we be having conscience votes, or are they kind of dead in the water? Was this a conscience vote? Alicia, you're not a big fan of a conscience vote.
Before we start, was it a conscious vote? Danny, you're very good on technicality and for accuracy for the podcast. What is a conscious vote? What's the difference from a free vote? Yeah, when it comes to well, no, he got the day wrong. That's not quite the same as parliamentary procedure.
I frequently get things wrong. I'm just confident about it. A free vote is usually held on matters of conscience, ethical issues. There is sometimes some discussion as to what crosses that threshold and what doesn't. Sometimes things that people think should be a conscience vote aren't always granted as that. But issues, usually around sexuality or life, are considered conscience issues and are therefore not tied by the party whipping system in the same way. There is sometimes kind of shadow whipping operations that either are kind of subtly directed by the party or just by campaign groups. So within this assisted dying and assisted suicide vote, there will have been attempts at whipping, but not by the party systems. They don't have the same carrot and sticks that party leadership have. And that's the thing, is that they try and encourage people to vote one way or the other by kind of saying, well, if you vote with the party, you might have a government ministerial post. If you do a good job of this, we might make you a private parliamentary secretary to the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. But then they also say, if you don't vote this way, we're going to kick you out. So that's what whipping is. A free vote doesn't have that.
Okay, so we have a long history of free or conscience votes on certain issues, the two last week being case in point, which, broadly speaking, I think is a healthy and sensible idea. And broadly speaking, Alicia's not so sure.
Can I just add one complication? Because so the vote on decriminalisation was a free vote, but then
accuracy
on the amendment, but then the overall, it is then brought into the overall bill, and that is then a government bill.
Yes.
So you don't then have a free vote on the government bill, which was then subject to regular whipping.
Okay, so we had a dynamic conversation yesterday, which we're going to rein in politely, but there will be points of disagreement.
Why rein it in?
Okay, the question is, this was a conscious vote. In no way, shape or form do I believe it was a conscious vote. I think taking to play influence that has come from above. When the Prime Minister says pre-general election that he supports this, he has a record of this. And on top of that, all these new MPs who have come into Parliament as a result of Keir Starmer's leadership and his recruitment, or the process, the new Labour kind of party policy recruitment for them coming into post. Yes, they can. It's a free vote, but really, is it? So that's my first question, or my pushback. My second real pushback on this is when we were engaging, and in fact, many of our members did an incredible job of engaging their MPs. MPs would write back and say, using this language, this is a conscious vote. I am voting with my conscience. However, my conscience has no space or consideration for your view, i.e. your opposition to this bill. And I take on board pretty much those who are proponents of it, both the stories, both the experience, the harms of both my constituency and all of that. And so that is my basis. So, or the MP's justification for why they voted in favour of the bill. And so I'm starting to see a trend where the language of conscious votes on really important ethical policy issues, decrim being one, assisted suicide being another, being somewhat of a kind of a get out clause of, should this bill pass and it prove to be fatal, MPs won't need to take accountability for their decision making in the same way, because it's kind of like, it was my conscience. I went with the decisions that were, or the information that was presented to me at the time, or rather I ignored quite a lot of it. And it's just really starting to annoy me that it's a handicap for good policy making and engagement of embracing difference of opinion, however strong your personal convictions are, because it's a conscious vote. I'm just going to go with that. And I don't think it's the same as saying the conscious clauses that are in, say, medical practice, where on the grounds of religion, a medic can say, I'm not wanting to participate in an abortion, or I don't want to participate, conscience clauses in the assisted suicide bill. That is very different, because that's a practitioner exercising their right, but also their decision, And I think it's fair in its balance because it's informed by practice and religious convictions or philosophical convictions. And so I don't think the MP's conscious voting is quite the same as how we allow for conscious clauses in same-sex marriage or
It's obviously different to an exemption in practice.
Yes.
I think I prefer the term free vote to conscience vote because people are basically not bound by their party position, position on it. They are free to vote how they like, and they can then make their mind up on whatever reasons they are. And I think primarily it is their choice. But for some MPs, they've said, actually, I'm going to poll my constituents on what I should think about this. Is that a better way of doing it? Is that a cop out for the MP to say, I'm going to host a little poll for my constituency? Oh, 78% said this, therefore I'm going to go with that. Yeah, that's a cop out. But is that better or worse than them not listening to constituents that have different views to their own? I think it is imperfect. People will choose all sorts of different sources to make their decisions. My main criticism of Alicia's position is the problem with party-led policymaking. Party-led policymaking just reduces the engagement of MPs with the actual policies and legislations going on. They are given the whip by the party management: vote for this clause, vote against that clause, vote for this clause. There is even less consideration of what's actually going through Parliament. Some of it is just because the bills and the legislation are so big, they can't have reached a decision about everything. It's just not plausible.
Yes, you just turn them into robots, essentially.
Yeah.
They just vote in line with the party. And that's an even bigger thing to hide behind, I would say, than conscience. At least I think they are accountable here for their votes because they have taken it on themselves and they can't hide behind the party machine and say, the party made me do it.
To who? Because the voting system will not show that at a future election.
But their votes are recorded.
Their names are against the vote and they have to own that they made that vote. And the other way, it's simply they say, I'm following the party system. This one at least, like, so, because 100 Labour MPs voted against this bill? Something in that region? I don't know the numbers in front of me, but I mean, certainly I think you're saying they can't break ranks from the party. There's a soft whipping. I agree. There was clearly soft whipping. Like there were clearly younger MPs feeling pressure. That's because they're not experienced. It's not because the free vote system did allow a lot, and all the parties were split on this. All the main parties. I'm not sure some of the smaller ones, but fundamentally, I mean, Reform right through, Lib Dems, Conservatives, Labour, all had split votes on this issue. So there was freedom to vote against it. Is it a perfect system? Definitely not. I think they can go to their constituents, and many said they did in this one and listened to what they were hearing in the mailbag. But the biggest issue for me here is, particularly for those of religious faith and Christians, is if the party put their position in their manifestos, they would all be pro-abortion to some degree. And then how can a Christian stand on that ticket? Because you're now you're going on the ticket and saying, I'm now with the party and I will have to vote in line with that. And for some people, it basically means they're excluded from those three main parties. And then
I hear that, but do we really think that MPs, new or long-serving, don't really know the party's disposition on abortion?
But
if you're a Labour MP, you're fully aware of where your party leans because they had a manifesto commitment in 2019.
But they were free to vote against it.
Yes, they were free to vote.
And somebody like on assisted suicide, for example, neither party put a manifesto position in play. If Labour had, they would have probably said yes.
And that's why I'm saying that's all the more abusing the mechanism of Parliament to disguise what is a government-leaning position.
Then I think you do exclude a Christian MP from the party because you can't stand officially on a ticket to say that if that becomes their official position. I couldn't stand for any of the parties who said, well, we're pro-abortion and you are mandated because that's now in our manifesto. You must vote with our position on that. And that basically excludes not just Christians. I think someone like Shabana Mahmood was very clear in her view. If you start putting that in, that will exclude people of faith. That is where John Lennox's piece comes back in for me. You exclude people of faith from that, or they have to set up their own party. And those become realistically much smaller side parties, and without PR you wouldn't get in.
But that argument won't work when we then come on to our final story about welfare reform, because that was in the manifesto commitment and yet there's a strong rebellion against it, Christian and not. So I think the clarity of a party being clear on what their position is helpful for you as a candidate. Do I actually ride behind this horse? I think that's fair, but then I think there's caveats for free voting on some of those things. I think you can do but I think you can accommodate that within a parliamentary
You
system.
can. I think it is no surprise that assisted suicide has come up in this parliament. It came up quickly, but I think most MPs or candidates at the last election would have known that one of the things that as MPs they would be likely to consider would be assisted suicide. It not being in a party manifesto means that the government or Keir Starmer had committed to Esther Rantzen that he was going to introduce a bill or have a bill introduced in some shape or form. Parliament would have a vote. I think that's a very unhelpful kind of commitment to make to dictate policy. So I think MPs knew that this was something that was going to come up. I think people are motivated and encouraged by all sorts of diverse sources. Some are good, some are bad. Some people have considered the issue well. Some people, I think, have considered the issue very badly, not just where they've landed, but their reasoning, their thought processes. But I think for some issues, it is really helpful for it to be outside of the party politics. Otherwise, you end up narrowing party politics to such an extent, as Peter said, it is too narrow. I think we might come on. Yeah, we probably will come on to this when we talk about welfare. If you have an explicit Christian party that takes positions on moral issues, you then also have to have policy positions on other issues that Christians will take a diversity of views on, and it then becomes really difficult because you end up then becoming either just a party for moral issues, or you end up saying, well, we are this ideologically, this type of party, left wing, right wing, big state, small state, whatever, and a Christian party. So you then probably have multiple Christian parties, and it gets in our system that just wouldn't work.
One that we're not going to resolve quickly and easily. We probably have a diversity of views. Hopefully that's helpful for you to hear a little bit about why we each think something slightly different on free and conscience votes. And it does take us into that last story then around the welfare reform bill that is coming in. It's due to be voted on Tuesday. They're listening to the news today. Wednesday, I think it still is here this week. It sounds like it might not be because there's such a big Labour rebellion on this, but that is a rebellion to, I suppose, our previous story. They're now voting against their party potentially, and the whips have been trying to lean in, and the harder they lean on this one, it seems like the more rebels come out.
Yeah, the vote's going to be pulled.
Size of numbers. So you're saying, Danny, the vote's almost certainly will be pulled because they don't have the numbers. They're not going to get it through.
And so the over 100 MPs on Tuesday came out with a statement saying that they would back, basically opposing the welfare reform changes to change disability benefits.
In a sentence,
So it's significantly changing personal independence payments. An awful lot of people who currently receive those would be worse off.
350,000 come out or worse off, and another 400,000 won't go in or something.
So both those currently on it and those in the future. It would also make changes to universal credit. So it shifts things around. Some people will come out better off, some people will come out worse off. But there was an awful lot of criticism of these proposals. So that came out. And basically, it'd been rumbling for a week or so that there was opposition to this. And I think the government have just failed to nip it in the bud, that now it is public and that many Labour MPs are publicly opposed to it. Another 30 odd have joined that since that letter went public. The government have tried to clamp down on it. The problem is because it is now so large, people have safety in numbers. So people are joining it, which is why I think the government will have to pull the vote in some form.
The welfare reform bill more generally, do you guys, either of you want to comment? Obviously, we speak on a lot of these stories. We directly engage in Parliament on these. We talk about them here. What are we saying? Have we said? How are we engaging around welfare reform more generally?
Definitely welfare reform as a policy is complex because there's multiple kind of benefits that impact one another. I would say in terms of this one, I think we'd take more of a overarching position of kind of similar to both the unborn and to the assisted suicide, that kind of sense of we need to care, we need to develop and curate a society that cares deeply for those on the margins or who are most vulnerable. And in the case of the disabled community, this reform negatively on the whole impacts them. And there's also other reforms that it talks about the impact on children who were within kind of a disabled household in terms of the wider reform stuff. So it's a complex policy area where we're not coming out saying this is the Evangelical Alliance position. But we'll definitely be talking more about the role and responsibility of the government to develop systems benefits that supports the most vulnerable.
Yeah, the challenge with particularly benefits and welfare issues is it is a very complex landscape. The government are seeking to make changes, to make cuts. Which ones should they make? Which ones shouldn't they make? It's quite hard for us to take a position, to hold a position across the breadth of that. So I think we generally stay at the higher level of principle of how governments should approach these type of policies, rather than the rights and wrongs of specific policies. And we recognise that evangelicals will take different positions on what is appropriate and what is helpful in terms of welfare and benefit changes. And that's generally how we try to engage with this.
Because this isn't just a rebellion for Keir Starmer, it's a problem for Rachel Reeves, because now they can't, if they make changes to this, they cannot balance the books. I mean, they've committed to a significant increase in defence spending. We understand why, and again, it's not something we take a direct view on, but we were critical of how they got that money was to take it out of the overseas aid budget. So they reneged on a commitment there and shifted it to, and we are living in obviously a different world right now. But the books simply won't balance if changes. That's the way they've chosen to make the changes, and so they're going to have to find money elsewhere. Because
they've already written off most of the benefit from the winter fuel allowance by walking back on most of that. So yes, you're right. The challenge they face is they have made these changes to save money, and if they're not able to deliver them, they're obviously not going to save the money.
You've been listening to Cross Section. You can, as always, get in touch with us at cross.section@eauk.org. You think I nearly knew that well enough to read it without looking at my computer. You can find us on socials, both Danny and myself on social media, at Danny Webster, and at Peter Lynas on Twitter, now called X.
Yep.
Are you on Instagram, Danny?
I am.
You're on Instagram.
I'm not going to actually remember what my...
So you'll find Danny and I there. Alicia is far too sensible to be on those social media platforms, so just appears here with her erudite views. Thank you for that. So we're just going to wrap up things. Just a reminder again to dig back into last week's episode if you want to listen to that interview around all that's happening in Iran. That we're going to keep an eye on that and keep commenting. It's worth saying you can now or shortly go on to the National Prayer Breakfast website. If you dig around, you will find John Lennox's contribution to it. It is on YouTube. And Dow Woolridge, I thought, did an excellent spoken word piece in that context as well. So I think that's a good probably 3 minutes or 4 minutes from him, and a good probably 15 minutes from John Lennox. It was fairly short, but it's a very useful piece about engagement in the public square, worth digging back into and finding those pieces. We will be back again next week, keeping you up to date on the intersection between faith and culture and politics on Cross Section. Thank you for being with us. Keith, I hope you enjoyed that little debate. Keith from Scotland was asking for a little bit more. This is where we disagreed. So that was all just for Keith on Conscience Blows Us. And with that, we'll sign off. Thank you and be blessed.